Some land keeps secrets until it trusts the right hands. The storm rolled across western Kansas like a freight train in the dark, dragging sheets of rain over miles of wheat stubble and empty fence lines. Lightning flashed low and white, turning the world into a photograph for half a second at a time. Ethan Cole gripped the wheel of his aging pickup and followed the dirt road by memory more than sight. Beside him sat Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat silvered at the muzzle and eyes that missed nothing. The dog had been restless for 10 miles, ears high, chest tight, staring through the windshield as if listening to something far beyond thunder. Ethan knew that posture. Ranger did not waste alarm on shadows. He only reacted when something mattered. The truck rattled past a broken windmill and a leaning mailbox painted with the faded name Boone. Then Ranger barked once, sharp and commanding, and lunged toward the passenger window. Ethan hit the brakes. Ahead, through curtains of rain, a tractor lay tilted near the north field, one rear wheel still spinning slowly in the mud. He was out of the truck before the engine finished coughing. Water soaked through his denim jacket in seconds. "Easy, boy," he called, though Ranger was already racing ahead. The smell of wet earth rose rich and cold from the ground. Somewhere metal clanged in the wind. Ethan rounded the tractor and saw an old man pinned awkwardly beneath the edge of the frame, not crushed but trapped, one boot sunk deep in the churned soil. His gray hat had blown away. Rain streamed down the lined map of his face. Yet his eyes were clear, stubborn, and strangely calm. "Took you long enough," the man muttered. Ethan almost smiled. "Hold still, sir." Years earlier, he had learned how panic wastes strength. He knelt in the mud, tested the angle, found a steel bar in the bed of the tractor, and used it for leverage. Ranger braced beside him, paws planted, barking into the wind as if ordering the storm itself to back off. The machine shifted an inch, then another. Ethan freed the man's leg and helped him sit upright against the tire. "Can you stand?" The old farmer nodded once, jaw tight. Together they crossed the field in stumbling steps while Ranger circled close, never letting the man drift. They reached the porch light of a weathered farmhouse just as thunder cracked overhead. Inside, the kitchen smelled of coffee grounds, cedar, and years that had passed quietly. Ethan wrapped the farmer's ankle with a clean towel and set a kettle on the stove. The old man watched him the whole time with a look Ethan could not place. Not gratitude. Not suspicion. Recognition, perhaps. "Name's Walter Boone," he said at last. "Ethan Cole." Walter glanced toward Ranger, who stood at the back door staring into the darkness beyond the yard. "That dog hears what men ignore." Ethan followed the dog's gaze. Across the rain-soaked fields, the north pasture lay black and empty except for one strange thing. The ground there seemed to tremble, ever so slightly, like a breath moving under a blanket. Walter's weathered hand tightened around the mug Ethan gave him. "If I don't wake one morning," he said softly, "don't let anyone dig that field." Then the lights flickered, the house sighed in the wind, and Ranger began to growl at the floorboards. The storm moved east before dawn, leaving the Kansas plains washed clean and strangely bright. Water clung to every fence wire like strings of glass. Ethan woke in a narrow guest room to the smell of biscuits and the distant creak of old wood settling back into silence. For a moment he forgot where he was. Then Ranger gave a low huff from beside the bed and looked toward the floorboards as if remembering for him. Ethan dressed and stepped into the kitchen. Walter Boone stood at the stove with one hand on the counter, favoring his ankle but refusing to admit it. Sunlight poured through the window and laid gold across the worn pine table. The old farmer had changed into denim overalls and a clean white shirt, though the collar sat crooked and one suspender hung loose. "You cook?" Walter asked without turning. "Enough to survive," Ethan said. "Then sit down and let somebody older do it better." Ranger settled near the back door, but his ears stayed fixed toward the north side of the house. He had not relaxed once since they arrived. Ethan noticed the walls were lined with photographs faded nearly pale. Harvest crews from another century. Horses hitched beside wagons. Children in straw hats. A younger Walter beside a woman with kind eyes and a wind-blown smile. My wife, June, Walter said quietly, following Ethan's gaze. She said this land listened better than most people. He placed a plate of biscuits and eggs on the table. They ate in companionable silence while the grandfather clock in the hall counted each minute like a careful witness. Outside, the field steamed under morning light. At last Walter pushed back his chair. Come on. They crossed the yard slowly. Ranger moved ahead, tail level, nose testing the air. The north pasture stretched wide and nearly empty, 50 acres of damp earth bordered by cottonwoods and a stone wall broken in 3 places. No cattle grazed there. No fresh tracks crossed it. The place felt unused in a way deeper than neglect. Ethan stopped near the center. You keep this field fallow? Walter gave a dry laugh. I keep it untouched. Ranger began pacing in tight circles, then halted near a patch of ground where the grass grew shorter and darker than the rest. He pawed once, then stepped back and stared. Ethan crouched and pressed his palm to the soil. It was warmer than the morning air. Not hot. Just wrong enough to notice. Beneath his hand came the faintest vibration, steady as a distant engine. Walter's face hardened with old memory. My father heard it too, he said. And his father before him. Ethan looked up. What is under here? The farmer's eyes moved across the pasture as though reading names no one else could see. A promise, he said. And trouble, if fools get curious. Wind passed through the cottonwoods with the sound of whispered pages. Back at the barn, Walter unlocked a cedar chest and drew out a ring of iron keys dark with age. One key was longer than the others, hand-forged and marked with a symbol like a rising sun. He placed the ring in Ethan's palm and closed Ethan's fingers around it. Keep these till I ask for them, he said. Some doors should only open for a man who knows how to leave them closed. Before Ethan could answer, Ranger barked sharply toward the road. 3 pickup trucks were turning through the gate. The 3 pickups rolled into the yard slow enough to seem polite and loud enough to feel otherwise. Dust, still damp from the night rain, lifted behind their tires in low gray ribbons. Ranger planted himself between Walter and the road, shoulders square, ears forward, every line of him alert. Ethan recognized the posture of a guardian who had already measured the room. The first truck stopped beside the pump house. A broad man in a pressed western shirt stepped out, boots too clean for farm work. He wore a silver watch bright enough to catch the sun from 20 feet away. 2 younger men followed him, carrying clipboards they had no reason to need. Morning, Walter, the broad man called, smiling the way some people use fences. Heard about your little mishap. Walter did not return the smile. Morning, Dale. Dale Mercer glanced at Ethan, then at Ranger, then back to Walter as if inventorying obstacles. Town council asked me to check in. There has been talk of development money coming west. Good roads, new grain storage, maybe a wind project. Your north pasture sits right where folks are interested. The old farmer's face became still as weathered stone. My pasture is not for sale. Dale spread his hands. No one said sale. Lease. Partnership. Progress. Ranger gave one low growl from deep in his chest. The younger men took a careful step backward. Ethan said nothing. He had learned long ago that loud men often reveal more when unchallenged. Dale's gaze drifted to the ring of keys half visible in Ethan's jacket pocket. It lingered there a fraction too long. And who is this? He asked. A man who helped when help was needed, Walter replied. That makes him family enough for today. Something sharp flickered behind Dale's smile, then vanished. Well. Good neighbors help neighbors. We will stop by again after you have rested. He tipped his hat without warmth and returned to the truck. Engines started. Gravel snapped under tires. Within moments the yard was quiet again except for the windmill clicking in uneven rhythm. Walter exhaled slowly, as though he had been holding back more than breath. That one would buy the sunrise if he could charge folks to look at it. Ethan watched the road until the trucks disappeared. They know something about the field. Walter nodded once. They know rumors. Men like Dale do not need truth if greed will do. The old farmer's ankle had swollen badly by noon. Ethan wrapped it again and insisted he stay off it. Walter protested from a chair on the porch while Ethan repaired a sagging gate and reset 2 fence posts loosened by spring thaw. Ranger moved between tasks like a foreman no one dared ignore. Yet every few minutes the dog paused and looked toward the north pasture. By late afternoon clouds drifted thin and high, leaving the land wide open under blue sky. Walter sat with a blanket over his knees, eyes on the distant field. June used to say secrets weigh more when one man carries them alone, he murmured. Then he reached into his shirt pocket and drew out a folded paper worn soft at the creases. He handed it to Ethan. Inside was a hand-drawn map of the farm, old enough that the ink had browned with age. Most of the fields were marked plainly. But the north pasture held only a single symbol, the same rising sun carved on the long iron key. Beneath it were 4 words written in careful script. Wait for the faithful one. As evening settled across the plains, Ranger suddenly barked 3 times and sprinted toward the barn. Ranger reached the barn before Ethan did and stood rigid at the wide sliding door, nose pressed to the gap where weathered wood no longer met cleanly. The evening light had turned amber, stretching long shadows across the yard and painting the old boards in gold. Inside, something tapped once, then fell silent. Ethan slid the door open. Dust floated in the beams of sunlight like slow snow. The barn smelled of hay, leather, oil, and seasons stacked on top of one another. Ranger moved in first, paws careful, head low, following a scent only he understood. Walter called from the porch, telling Ethan not to climb anything foolish, which sounded less like warning and more like habit. Ethan smiled despite himself and stepped inside. Rusted tools lined one wall. A seed spreader slept beneath a tarp. Old bridles hung like forgotten question marks. Ranger ignored it all and went straight to the loft ladder. Halfway up, he barked twice and looked back. Ethan climbed after him. The boards groaned but held. In the loft, beneath rolled fencing wire and feed sacks gone stiff with age, sat a narrow cedar trunk banded with iron. Its lid bore the same rising sun Ethan had seen on the key and the map. Ranger placed one paw on the chest and wagged his tail once, solemnly, as if presenting evidence. Ethan carried the trunk down and set it on a workbench just as Walter limped through the doorway with his cane. The old man stared at the symbol for a long moment, and the years seemed to gather around him. I wondered if the barn would give that up before I did, he said softly. Ethan held out the ring of keys. Walter shook his head. No. You open it. The long iron key fit with a deep metallic click. Inside lay no gold, no deeds, no stacks of cash. There were journals wrapped in oilcloth, a brass compass dark with age, several black and white photographs, and a leather tube tied with blue ribbon faded nearly gray. Walter lifted one photo with trembling fingers. It showed men and women standing beside a stone staircase descending into the earth. Lanterns hung behind them. Their faces were serious but proud. My grandparents, he said. And the keepers before me. Ethan unrolled the leather tube. Inside was a larger map than the one from the house, hand-drawn with remarkable care. It showed tunnels, chambers, wells, streets laid in a circle, and at the center a place marked only with one word, sanctuary. Ethan looked up slowly. This is real. Walter gave a tired nod. Real enough to ruin lives if the wrong men reach it first. Outside, wind brushed the prairie grass in waves that sounded almost like distant applause. Walter lowered himself onto an overturned bucket and motioned for Ethan to sit. During the Dust Bowl, families hid below when the sky turned black. Before that, settlers used the chambers when winters killed livestock and roads vanished. Before them, others carved the first stone. Nobody knows all their names. Ranger lay at Walter's boots, eyes fixed on the old man as if listening to a language beyond words. "Why keep it secret?" Ethan asked. Walter looked toward the north field through the barn slats where dusk had begun to gather. "Because anything that shelters the desperate will always tempt the greedy." He coughed, then steadied himself. "And because one gate only opens from above." The barn fell quiet enough to hear swallows nesting in the rafters. Then from somewhere under the floor came a faint sound, soft but unmistakable, like a bell rung deep underground. Ranger rose at once. Walter closed his eyes. "It has not done that in 30 years, he whispered. "It knows someone new has arrived." Night settled slowly over the farm, spreading blue shadows across the wheat stubble and turning the windows of the house into squares of warm amber light. Ethan carried the cedar trunk inside while Walter followed with careful steps and Ranger walked behind them like a sentry, making sure no secret was dropped along the way. The journals were stacked on the kitchen table beside a lantern, though the electricity still worked. Walter said some stories deserved older light. Ethan understood that more than he expected. The first journal opened with neat handwriting dated 1935. "Dust entered through cracks, buried the porch by noon, and we slept below again." Another entry spoke of children playing in stone streets under lamplight while storms raged above like angry seas. Ethan turned pages slowly, hearing not ink but lives. Ranger lay near the back door, chin on paws, eyes open. Every few moments his ears twitched toward the floor. Walter sipped tea and watched the dog. "He hears the vents," the old farmer said. "Air still moves through shafts hidden across the property. The place below was built to breathe." Ethan looked up. "You have been down there recently?" Walter smiled without humor. "Not in years. Stairs do not get kinder with age." Outside, the wind rose and moved around the house in long sighs. Somewhere a loose chain tapped metal in patient rhythm. Walter reached for one final journal bound in dark leather and placed it before Ethan. "Read the marked page." Inside, a ribbon rested beside a passage written in firmer hand than the others. "If ever the keeper can no longer guard the gate, choose the one who arrives by mercy, not ambition. Choose the one the dog trusts." Ethan read it twice, then set the journal down. "You cannot mean me." Walter's gaze held steady. "I mean exactly what I have been praying to mean." Silence settled between them, not awkward but heavy with consequence. Ethan had drifted for years from job to job, town to town, carrying skills people needed and a loneliness they did not see. No land had ever waited for him. No room had expected his return. Ranger rose suddenly and padded to the pantry wall. He sniffed once, pawed twice, then stepped back. Ethan pressed the paneling where the dog had touched. One board shifted inward with a soft click. Behind it lay a narrow cavity holding a brass tube and a single envelope addressed in careful script, "To the next keeper." Walter closed his eyes as if memory had touched him on the shoulder. "June hid that after her diagnosis," he whispered. Ethan opened the envelope. Inside was one sheet of paper. "Trust the bell. Trust the dog. Open only when the ground calls 3 times. Beneath the note was June Boone. Before Ethan could ask another question, the house trembled so gently it might have been imagination. Then it came again, a low vibration under their boots. Ranger stood tall. A third tremor followed, stronger than the first 2. In the hallway, the grandfather clock stopped mid-tick. From somewhere below the kitchen floor rose the same distant sound they had heard in the barn, clear as silver in deep water. One bell. Then another. Then a third. Walter gripped the edge of the table, eyes shining with fear and wonder together. "It has chosen tonight," he said. He pointed toward the pantry wall where darkness waited behind the loosened panel. "The stair begins there." Ethan slid the pantry shelves aside and found a narrow wooden door hidden behind flour sacks and old canning jars. Its hinges were black with age, its handle smooth from hands long gone. Ranger stood so close his shoulder brushed Ethan's leg, every muscle alert, tail still as carved stone. Walter remained at the table, one hand pressed to his chest, watching with the solemn expression of a man seeing prophecy arrive wearing work boots. Ethan inserted the long iron key into the lock. It turned with surprising ease, followed by a deep mechanical sound somewhere below, as if old gears had remembered their purpose. Cool air drifted upward carrying the scent of limestone, dry earth, and something faintly sweet, like cedar kept in darkness for decades. Beyond the door, stone steps spiraled down into shadow. A lantern hung on a hook beside the frame. Walter nodded toward it. "Take that one. My grandfather said the first descent should never be made with electric light." Ethan lit the wick. Golden flame bloomed and pushed back the dark by inches. He looked at Walter. "You are not coming." The old farmer smiled gently. "My road was to guard the entrance. Yours may be to learn what it opens." Ethan wanted to protest, but some truths arrive complete. He simply nodded and started down. Ranger moved one step ahead, pausing every few feet to look back. The stairway wound deeper than seemed possible beneath an ordinary farmhouse. Their footsteps echoed softly, multiplied by unseen walls. After 50 steps the air grew warmer. After 70, Ethan heard water moving somewhere far below. At the bottom, the stairs opened into a vaulted chamber supported by hand-cut stone columns. Dust lay thin across the floor, untouched except for a line of tiny paw prints that could not have been fresh and yet looked newly made. Lantern brackets lined the walls. Ethan lit two more as he passed, and circles of amber spread outward, revealing carved symbols of wheat, stars, and rising suns. Ranger trotted ahead into an arched tunnel wide enough for a wagon. The floor beneath Ethan's boots was smooth stone worn by generations of travel. He felt no fear now, only the strange calm that sometimes follows wonder. The tunnel ended at a second door of ironwood bound with brass. Across it were etched words in old lettering: "Shelter is wealth. Mercy is law." Ethan touched the handle. It opened inward without resistance. Beyond it, he stopped breathing for a moment. A hidden street stretched before him beneath a vast underground ceiling. Stone homes lined both sides, each with shuttered windows and front steps swept clean by time. An old well stood at the center square beside a fountain carved with prairie birds. Farther on rose a chapel no taller than a barn, its bell tower reaching into darkness where lantern hooks vanished from sight. Channels of clear water ran along the street edges, still flowing with a quiet silver sound. Ranger padded to the fountain and drank once, then looked back as if to say this place had been waiting politely. Ethan stepped forward slowly, lantern trembling in his hand. On one porch sat a child's wooden wagon. In another window hung curtains stitched with blue flowers. Nothing was broken. Nothing had been looted. It felt less abandoned than paused. Then from the chapel tower came 3 soft chimes, each note pure and impossibly alive. Ranger barked once in answer. Ethan turned toward the sound and noticed something else in the dust of the street. Fresh footprints. One set only. Barely visible. Leading from the chapel door toward the deeper tunnels beyond. The footprints were small, narrow, and too clear to belong to memory. Ethan raised the lantern higher and followed them across the silent square while Ranger moved ahead with the focused patience of a tracker who trusted his nose more than his eyes. The chapel door stood slightly open. Inside, rows of simple wooden benches faced a stone altar carved with wheat sheaves and stars. Dust covered everything except a path down the center aisle where the same prints continued toward the back wall. The bell rope swayed gently though no breeze touched it. Ethan felt the old stillness of sacred places, the kind that asks for quiet before answers. Ranger stopped at the altar and sniffed beneath it, then pawed once. Ethan set the lantern down and examined the stone base. Hidden in the carving was a brass latch worn nearly smooth. He pulled it. The altar shifted aside on silent runners, revealing a narrow passage descending farther into the earth. The fresh prints led straight down. Ethan glanced back toward the open door where the underground street waited in lantern glow. Somewhere far above, thunder rolled across the plains like a distant memory. He took a breath and followed. The passage opened into a circular chamber lined with shelves. Hundreds of jars stood sealed and labeled in careful handwriting. Seeds. Corn. Beans. Wheat. Squash. Apples. A library of harvests sleeping through decades. Ranger moved from shelf to shelf, tail wagging slowly now, tension easing for the first time since they entered the hidden city. Ethan ran a finger over one jar and found no spoilage, no rot, only patient preservation. In the center of the room stood a long oak table with ledgers stacked in neat rows. He opened one. Each page recorded names, births, weather patterns, planting methods, water levels, remedies, songs, and stories. It was more than storage. It was a memory vault for people who knew hard years always return. A soft sound came from the far side of the chamber. Ethan turned sharply and lifted the lantern. There, seated in a wooden rocking chair beside a small lamp already lit, was an elderly woman wrapped in a blue shawl. Her silver hair was braided neatly down one shoulder. Her eyes were bright as creek water and entirely unsurprised. Ranger approached her at once, sniffed her hand, then rested his head against her knee. "Good dog," she said, voice warm and clear. "He remembers manners better than most men." Ethan stood speechless for a heartbeat. "Who are you?" She smiled. "Name is Clara Boone. Walter's sister." Ethan stared. Walter had never mentioned a sister. "He told the town you passed away 20 years ago." Clara gave a small laugh that echoed kindly in the stone room. "That was easier than explaining why I stayed." She gestured to the shelves around them. "Someone had to keep watch over what feeds tomorrow." Ethan slowly sat across from her. "Walter knew you were here." "Every Sunday," she said. "He sent bread down the old lift and news about weather, calves, and foolish politicians." She studied Ethan with the same measuring kindness Walter carried. "And he said one day a tired man with honest hands would come with a shepherd dog." Ethan felt the room tilt in a way no earthquake could manage. "Why me?" Clara reached across the table and tapped the ledger open. Before him. On the page was a note written in Walter's familiar hand only days earlier. "If Ethan Cole arrives, trust him as I do. Give him the deed and show him the heart of the city." Before Ethan could speak, the chamber lights flickered. Not electric light, but old lantern flames bending together toward one tunnel mouth. Ranger rose instantly and growled low. Clara's smile faded. "Then we are out of time," she said softly. "Dale Mercer has found another entrance." Clara moved faster than her years suggested. She lifted a lantern from the table and crossed to a wall of shelves where one narrow board concealed a crank of polished iron. With 3 steady turns, a deep mechanism answered somewhere in the stone like a waking giant. "Old passages," she said. "Built for storms and thieves." Ranger stood at the tunnel mouth, hackles raised, listening to footsteps that had not yet reached human ears. Ethan felt the same calm focus that had carried him through harder nights than this one. "How many entrances are there?" he asked. 3 known, Clara replied. 2 sealed. 1 forgotten by everyone except greedy men and old maps. She handed Ethan a folded packet wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were deeds, survey records, and notarized letters bearing county seals from decades past. Walter Boone had signed them 2 weeks earlier. The final page transferred the farm and all mineral, water, and historical rights to Ethan Cole upon Walter's passing. Ethan stared at the name as if it belonged to someone else. Why would he do this? Clara's eyes softened. Because land knows when it has been loved and when it has only been priced. Above them, a faint metallic clang echoed through the tunnel. Dale Mercer was close. Clara pointed toward a side corridor. Take the records to Walter. If men like Dale claim this place first, they will sell stones by the pound and history by the ticket. Ranger barked once and lunged toward the main passage. Ethan followed him into the underground street where lanterns now glowed brighter, fed by drafts moving through hidden vents. The city seemed awake, every shadow alert. At the square, he heard voices carrying from beyond the chapel. Dale's smooth confidence had turned sharp with excitement. Spread out, he called. Anything old gets photographed. Anything valuable gets loaded. Ethan did not see the men yet, but he saw their flashlight beams cutting across stone walls like careless knives. Ranger guided him through a narrow alley between two cottages and into a passage no wider than a closet. It climbed steeply. The dog paused at a wooden hatch hidden behind stacked grain bins. Ethan pushed it open and emerged inside the barn above, lungs filling with prairie air that smelled of rain and hay. Dawn had begun to gray the eastern horizon. Walter sat in a chair near the workbench, blanket over his knees, as if he had been waiting for a verdict. When he saw Ethan and the packet in his hands, he closed his eyes in relief. So she trusted you, he whispered. Ethan knelt beside him and placed the papers on the bench. Your sister is alive. She is below. A tear escaped down one weathered cheek. Walter did not wipe it away. Then the Lord has been kinder than I deserved. Ranger pressed his muzzle into the old man's palm. Engines roared outside. Dale's trucks had returned, joined now by a county utility van and two more pickups. Doors slammed. Voices gathered. Walter straightened with surprising dignity and pointed to a metal box beneath the bench. Inside lay a recorder, a stack of cassette tapes, and one envelope marked for the sheriff. I spent 20 years collecting what Dale has done, he said. Bribes, false surveys, stolen water leases, threats dressed as handshakes. Ethan looked toward the barn doors where boots approached over gravel. Why not turn him in before now? Walter gave a tired smile. Because truth needs timing, same as harvest. The doors slid open. Morning light poured in behind Dale Mercer and 6 men in clean jackets. His eyes landed on the papers in Ethan's hand, then on Walter, then on the open floor hatch Ranger now guarded like a stone statue. Dale's smile returned, thin as wire. Well, he said softly. Looks like we are finally getting to the bottom of things. Dale Mercer stepped into the barn as though he already owned the boards beneath his boots. Morning light framed him in. Pale gold, but there was no warmth in the way he looked around. His men spread out near the walls, pretending casual interest in saddles, tools, and hay bales while their eyes kept drifting to the floor hatch Ranger guarded. The German shepherd stood silent and still, which somehow felt louder than barking. Walter Boone rose slowly from his chair. Age had bent his shoulders, but not the part of a man that decides where he will stand. You are trespassing, he said. Dale smiled. I came to help neighbors through a difficult transition. His gaze shifted to Ethan's hand where the oilcloth packet rested. And to ensure important records do not get misplaced. Ethan said nothing. He had learned that some men reveal themselves fastest when given room. Dale took 2 easy steps closer. Walter, folks in town worry you were pressured. You have had a fall. Your judgment may be clouded. The insult hung in the air like smoke. Walter's eyes sharpened. My judgment improved the day I stopped trusting you. One of Dale's men gave a nervous cough. Outside, another engine approached, then stopped near the house. Ranger's ears flicked but he did not move from the hatch. Dale's smile thinned. You cannot hide what is under this farm forever. Survey scans, old county maps, whispers from your hired hands. We know there is something valuable below. Walter laughed softly, and the sound carried more pity than amusement. That is your first mistake. You think value always means money. Dale's patience slipped. Move the dog. Ranger answered with a low growl that vibrated through the boards. Ethan placed one hand lightly on the dog's back, more partnership than restraint. He is already moved, Ethan said. He moved to exactly where he wants to be. For a moment no one spoke. Then the side door opened and Sheriff Lena Torres entered with rain boots, a canvas jacket, and the expression of someone who preferred facts over theater. Behind her came two deputies and Clara Boone, blue shawl around her shoulders, eyes bright as morning water. Dale went pale before he could stop it. Sheriff, he said quickly. Good timing. We may have fraud here. Lena looked from Walter to Ethan to Clara. Then back to Dale. Funny word choice. Ethan handed her the envelope from the metal box and the oilcloth packet of deeds. She read in silence while the barn seemed to hold its breath. When she finished, she opened the cassette recorder Walter had prepared and pressed play. Dale's own voice filled the room from years earlier, smooth and unmistakable, discussing fake easements, payoff amounts, and how to pressure elderly owners into selling cheap. No one moved. Even the swallows in the rafters seemed to listen. Dale took a step backward. That could be anyone. Lena raised one eyebrow. It could also be enough for a judge to become curious. Walter sank gently back into his chair, tired but lighter somehow. Clara stood beside him and touched his shoulder. Brother and sister looked at each other as though decades had folded closed in a single morning. Dale's men quietly drifted away from him, discovering sudden interest in the floorboards. Ranger finally relaxed and sat beside the hatch. Then from below came three clear bell chimes rising through the cracks in the barn floor. Everyone froze. Sheriff Lena looked down. What in the world is under there? Walter smiled toward Ethan. History, he said softly. And it belongs to the man who came here by mercy. Sheriff Lena Torres was the first to move. She looked at the deputies, then at Dale Mercer, whose confidence had begun to leak away like air from a punctured tire. Mr. Mercer, you and your friends can wait outside, she said calmly. If anyone chooses not to wait, I can make the decision easier. No one argued. Dale glanced once toward the floor hatch, then toward the open barn doors where sunlight now poured across the yard. He walked out without another word. The deputies followed close behind him. Silence returned in their wake, broken only by the windmill clicking and the faint echo of bells beneath the boards. Lena turned to Walter. You knew about this all along. Walter nodded. Knew enough to protect it. Not enough to explain it. He looked at Ethan. That part was waiting on him. Clara stepped forward and handed Lena one of the ledgers from below. The sheriff leafed through pages of names, crop records, storm shelters, births, and signatures reaching back more than a century. Her expression softened into something close to reverence. This is not treasure, she said quietly. It is heritage. Walter smiled. Same thing, if your heart is healthy. By mid-morning they descended together through the pantry stair. Ethan led with the lantern, Ranger one step ahead, tail level and proud. Lena followed with a flashlight she barely used, choosing instead to let the old glow reveal the old world at its own pace. When they emerged into the underground street, even the sheriff stopped breathing for a moment. Sunlight from hidden shafts poured in narrow columns from the ceiling above, turning drifting dust into gold ribbons. Water still ran clear beside the stone walkways. Doors stood painted in colors time had faded gently rather than erased. My God, Lena whispered. There is a whole town down here. Clara nodded. There was. Then drought, then roads, then modern life. People moved upward and forgot what once saved them. They toured the chapel, the seed vault, the communal bakery with its clay ovens intact, and a schoolroom where chalk lessons still faintly marked a slate board. In one storage hall they found crates of hand tools wrapped in oilcloth and shelves of jars preserved with such care they looked packed last season. In another chamber they found maps showing aquifers, spring lines, and irrigation designs decades ahead of their time. Ethan ran a hand over one blueprint. This could help farms all across the county. Walter's eyes shone. That was always the greater wealth. They reached the central square where the fountain murmured softly. Ranger sat beside it, ears perked, staring at the chapel tower. Then the dog barked once and trotted toward a narrow lane behind the old post office. Ethan followed and found a final building with a brass plaque over the door, Council House. Inside stood a round table and 12 chairs. At the center rested a cedar box sealed with the rising sun emblem. Walter gestured for Ethan to open it. Inside lay one final deed, newly notarized, naming Ethan Cole's sole trustee of the underground settlement and steward of the Boone Farm, with instructions that all profits be used for restoration, education, and local relief. Beneath it was a folded note in Walter's hand. Home is not where you started. It is where you choose to serve. Ethan read the line twice before he could trust his voice. When he looked up, Walter seemed suddenly smaller, the long labor of secrecy finally setting down its weight. Clara took her brother's hand. Lena removed her hat. Even the underground bells were still. Walter smiled at Ethan, then at Ranger. Now, he said softly, let me rest knowing the right people found the door. They brought Walter Boone back to the farmhouse just before noon. The prairie sun stood high and gentle, warming the porch boards and turning the fields bright as brass. Clara walked beside her brother with one hand under his arm, the way siblings do when years have stripped away pride and left only love. Ethan followed carrying the cedar box and ledgers, while Ranger moved close to Walter's heel as if guarding a commander on his final march. Inside, the kitchen smelled of fresh coffee and old pine. Walter asked to sit by the window facing the north pasture. Lena drew the curtains wide. Beyond the glass, wheat rippled in long golden bands beneath the wind, and nothing in that ordinary view hinted at the city sleeping below. That is how good secrets survive, Walter murmured. They learn to look plain. Clara laughed softly through tears she did not hide. She made soup from pantry vegetables while Ethan repaired a loose chair rung and mended a latch that had bothered Walter for years. No one said much. Some afternoons know they are sacred and do not need help becoming so. Ranger lay across Walter's boots, breathing slow and steady. Every so often the old farmer rested a hand on the dog's head and smiled as if remembering younger days. By 3 o'clock, neighbors began arriving after hearing the sheriff had taken Dale Mercer into custody. They came carrying pies, casseroles, flowers, and the embarrassed kindness of people who realized too late whom they should have trusted sooner. Walter welcomed each one without bitterness. He spoke to widows, shook hands with ranchers, teased schoolteachers, and asked after children by name. He had spent a lifetime planting decency in small rows. Now harvest came all at once. When the room emptied again, he motioned Ethan closer. From beneath the blanket he drew a worn leather wallet. Inside was a photograph of June Boone standing in a sunflower field, sunlight in her hair, eyes full of mischief. On the back she had written, "If you ever grow lonely, be useful. It helps." Walter handed the picture to Ethan. "She saved me more times than I can count," he said. "Maybe she sent you." Ethan looked down, unable to answer for a moment. "You saved me too," he said quietly. Walter's gaze moved to the window, then to Clara, then to Ranger. "Then we are even." Late afternoon light softened the room into honey and shadow. The grandfather clock in the hall, silent since the tremors began, suddenly resumed ticking on its own. Clara covered her mouth. Walter chuckled. Stubborn thing hated being wrong. He grew tired soon after. Lena stood respectfully near the door while Ethan and Clara remained beside him. Ranger rose and placed both front paws gently on the edge of Walter's chair, nose resting near the old man's hand. Walter stroked the dog's muzzle once more. "Best deputy I ever met," he whispered. Then he looked at Ethan with clear, peaceful eyes. "Keep the place open to honest people. Close it to greed. And if you ever doubt what to do, ask the dog first." His breathing slowed like wind settling after a storm. Outside, from far beneath the earth, 3 soft bell tones drifted upward through the floorboards and into the room. Walter smiled at the sound as if hearing an old friend call his name. When the final note faded, so did he. No one spoke for a long while. Even grief seemed gentle there. At sunset, the whole town gathered on the porch steps and in the yard below. Clara stood beside Ethan and held his arm. Sheriff Lena removed her hat. Ranger faced the north pasture, ears lifted. Under a sky washed pink and gold, the hidden city rang its bells again, this time for farewell. Walter Boone was buried 3 days later beneath a cottonwood tree on the rise west of the farmhouse, where the land rolled open. Enough to watch every sunrise coming for miles. The whole town came. Men who once doubted him carried folding chairs. Women who had known June Boone brought jars of wildflowers and peach pie no one would eat until later. Children stood quietly because even they could feel that something steady had left the world. Ethan wore the only dark jacket he owned. Ranger sat beside him through the service without moving once. When the pastor finished, Clara stepped forward and read a note Walter had written years earlier. "If you wish to honor me, mend something broken. Feed somebody hungry. Forgive somebody slow. And do not waste money on fancy stones." People laughed through tears, which seemed exactly what Walter intended. After the crowd drifted home, Ethan remained by the grave until dusk. The wind moved through the cottonwood leaves with a sound like pages turning. Ranger leaned against his leg. "I do not know how to keep all this," Ethan said softly. The dog looked toward the farmhouse, then toward the north pasture, then back at him. Some answers do not need words. The next morning began the work. Sheriff Lena Torres returned with county historians, engineers, and 2 archivists from Wichita who nearly cried when they saw the underground schoolhouse untouched. Clara supervised everyone with surprising authority and no patience for nonsense. "Wash your boots before entering," she told one professor. "The dead built cleaner than the living." Dale Mercer, meanwhile, faced fraud charges, property tampering complaints, and a line of former partners suddenly eager to remember details. News spread fast across Kansas. By the end of the week, reporters camped near the road, drones buzzed overhead until Lena banned them, and offers arrived from developers who used phrases like destination experience and monetization corridor. Ethan burned those letters in the kitchen stove unopened. Instead, he studied Walter's ledgers and the water maps found below. The underground channels still fed a natural spring system running beneath several drought-struck farms nearby. With county approval, engineers reopened stone valves and restored flow lines abandoned for generations. Within days, dry wells on neighboring properties began filling again. Old ranchers removed their hats when they saw water rise where none had stood in years. "That city paid rent," one of them whispered. Ethan converted the barn into a temporary museum and community hall. One side held tools, journals, and photographs. The other side held folding tables where volunteers packed food boxes for struggling families. Clara organized the pantry. Lena handled security. Local teenagers gave tours after school and learned more history in a month than any textbook had offered them. Ranger appointed himself official greeter and accepted payment in ear scratches. Yet at night, when the visitors were gone and the fields lay silver under moonlight, Ethan still felt the old loneliness trying to return through cracks in the quiet. Then he would hear footsteps behind him and find Ranger waiting by the pantry door. Together they would descend to the underground square where lanterns now glowed again. They would sit by the fountain and listen to water speak in patient tones. One evening Ethan opened the cedar box once more and found a final envelope hidden beneath the trustee deed. It was addressed in June Boone's handwriting. To the man who stayed. Inside was a key Ethan had never seen and a note only one sentence long. Some homes have one more room than they first reveal. Ranger stood at once, ears high, and began walking toward the deepest tunnel beyond the chapel where no map had marked a door. Some doors wait for years because timing is part of the lock. Ethan followed Ranger beyond the chapel into the deepest tunnel, carrying a lantern in one hand and June Boone's key in the other. The air grew cooler there, touched by the clean scent of spring water and old stone. Behind him, the restored city glowed softly with new life, but ahead the darkness felt older than memory. Ranger moved with certainty, never hesitating at a turn. At the tunnel's end stood a wall of limestone so plain it could have hidden in plain sight forever. Only one detail betrayed it, a narrow brass keyhole shaped like the rising sun. Ethan inserted the key. For a moment nothing happened. Then deep within the rock, hidden gears turned with the slow dignity of something built to outlast impatience. The wall parted inward. Beyond it lay not a vault of gold, not stacks of coins, but a wide chamber filled with sunlight pouring from a shaft above. In the center grew an underground orchard. Apple trees, pear trees, fig trees, all carefully pruned and thriving beneath mirrored skylights that carried daylight from the surface through stone tubes lined with polished metal. Water channels curved around each row in perfect silence. Bees moved lazily among blossoms as if seasons obeyed a gentler law down here. Ethan stood speechless. Ranger ran ahead through the grass, suddenly playful as a pup, chasing dust motes in the beams. At the far end of the chamber sat a small white cottage with blue shutters. Smoke curled from its chimney though no fire had been lit in decades. Ethan approached slowly and opened the door. Inside were shelves of books, jars of preserves, quilts folded neatly, and a rocking chair facing a window of crystal set into stone. On the table rested a letter in June Boone's handwriting beside a fresh loaf of bread that smelled impossibly warm. Ethan touched it and found it still soft. He opened the letter with trembling hands. If you are reading this, then kindness reached farther than greed. Walter and I built this room when the world above felt too loud. We planted trees where no drought could touch them and stored enough seed to restart hope more than once. But the greatest thing we saved was a place for someone weary to belong. If that someone is you, stay as long as needed. If it is another, open the door again. Ethan sat in the rocking chair and let tears come without shame. He had crossed states, years, and loneliness without knowing he was walking toward a home someone prepared before they knew his name. Ranger rested his head on Ethan's knee and sighed the deep sigh of a creature who knows the journey is over. In the months that followed, the Boone farm became a landmark of mercy instead of greed. The underground city taught schoolchildren history, farmers water wisdom, and strangers that shelter can outlive storms. Clara ran the orchard